Media in Society. This is the part one of Media in Politics. In this lecture, we examine another dimension of modern media, its impact on our political system and how we govern ourselves. We're going to focus a little bit here on foundations, and then in the next lecture, I'll consider campaign advertising and how the mass media have changed our system of governance through the way we advertise and market our politicians. We'll talk about the general trend of huge increases in ad spending from election to election, from year to year. And then later we'll pay particular attention to the role of new media technologies in campaigning, including concepts that are in the news quite a bit, including fake news, and the tendency in algorithm-driven social media to really only show us political news that fits our values, that fits our pre-existing assumptions and views, which is a potentially very disturbing trend that a lot of people are worried about. But before we get to all that, I want to ask, what does all this ad spending and communicating mean for what we call in this country governance? That is, how citizens in an assumed free and open democratic society, how do they participate in public decision making? How do they make decisions as a collective people? That's the act of governing. It's the process. So the idea then is that those people discuss and think about this, then they elect their leaders who are supposed to be sort of listening in, and then they go and make decisions, but in our best interest as citizens. That's what the founders of this country were wanting, I think, when they thought about governance. But the big question, what's the role of media in all this? Are media in all their forms, are they influencing the discussion of the issues? Are they influencing the way candidates campaign and the voting process overall? In theory, the news media are supposed to increase transparency and accountability by ensuring that ordinary people like us have access to the information we need to, facilitate discussions of policies and how we should be governed. Immersed from cradle to grave in this consumer society that we have, it really is vital to understand, to interpret, to criticize meanings and messages we receive through the mass media in general, and really the news media in particular. So the question, again, are media doing this for us? So we're arguing that the mass media are major shapers of the public's beliefs and ideas about issues. And this case has been heavily debated for a long time, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. There's a lot of examples I could share with you, but one case in point, what's now called the famous Dewey-Lippmann debate, which took place in the 1920s. The debate focused on the importance of an open, public discussion about how we govern ourselves in the United States, and again, the role of the media in that process. And I'll have more on John Dewey in a moment, but first, the other guy in this dichotomy, Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann was a really smart dude. He was a journalist, a philosopher, a political aide. He was an author of a number of books. He attended Harvard. He graduated in just 3 years. He worked as an aide to various politicians, then as a journalist, considered a great political mind and philosopher. He wrote, like I said, several books, including one called Public Opinion. He also wrote a book called The Phantom Public, which will come up a little bit later. He was called a poet of ideas by a fellow journalist and admirer. Lippmann's opinions, which were often shared in newspaper opinion pieces, were so important to the country that he was featured on the cover of Time magazine in 1931. So that was kind of a big deal back in those days. It was like winning an Oscar or something like that. It's just a big deal. So see what you think of his argument. He's arguing that members of the general public, that is, people like you, are largely disinterested in politics. He believed the public, someone like you, that they're cynical, and you're perfectly willing to let outside experts make decisions for you on how the country should be run. So kind of ask yourself, do you feel that way about yourself? This results in the creation of what he called the phantom public. You, me, all of us, Lippmann argued, if we fall within that realm, that we're very much like phantoms. We're like ghosts. We're there, but just not really participating. So as far as the role of news media, according to Lippmann, he was one of the early leaders of the movement that called for objectivity in journalism, and he saw the role of media as nothing more than supplying basic factual information to people, and nothing more. Just basic factual information. Don't get into opinions, don't editorialize, just give us the facts. He was arguing that the bigger kind of opinions should come out of what he wanted to organize, which were called truth teams, these little think tanks, which really came out of political science. They would really keep track of what was going on in the country and the world, and then present their ideas for all of us that would help us solve various problems. But the media, just stay out of it, just give us information, then get out of the way. And if anything, he was worried that the media were presenting inaccurate pictures of reality. So not exactly an optimistic viewpoint about we the people and our media, correct? So if you're looking for something more hopeful, you would turn to a person named John Dewey. And I've got a couple of clips of him speaking. I always like to show you these. Couldn't find Lippmann anywhere. There's no early film of him. But you can get a sense for Dewey. He's not the most exciting speaker, but he's got some great ideas.
The world is moving at a tremendous rate. No one knows where. We must prepare our children not for the world of the past, not for our world, but for their world, the world of the future.
I like his hand movements there. You must have been coached to do that. They're probably saying, hey, John, you look a little wooden up there. Could you move around a little bit? So he did. So he's a major 20th century American philosopher and educator. He's an author. He's a professor of philosophy at Columbia. He was also featured on the cover of Time magazine, which shows his stature. In his case, it was in 1928. Time reported that Dewey was known as the, quote, philosopher of the American continent. Again, like Lippmann, the debate about the importance of public discussion and the role of media in that process can actually be traced back to these two people, pro and con. So first of all, on the pro side, Dewey had really a more positive view of his fellow Americans, people like you, me, our friends, our families. He believed that discussion, that interacting with others, comparing notes about what is going on, that it's a vital habit of democracy that requires citizens like us to participate in what he called this great conversation. He pointed out that a lot of the stuff that we talk about comes from the media, so we can't just sort of discount the media that way. So as you might imagine, Dewey took great exception to Lippmann's ideas. And they actually did face off, and they would kind of play out these arguments, and they would debate each other in this series of lectures in the 20s where Dewey took on the role of a populist advocate, you would call him. Populism is defined as, seeking to represent the interests of ordinary people. Dewey argued in his critically acclaimed book, The Public and Its Problems, that public discussion is a vital habit of democracy. And he talks about this great conversation. So Dewey saw the role of media as very different than Lippmann. He envisioned the media as providing the space, the forum, the venue for debate and for the presentation of opposing opinions on important issues of the day. So this notion of space and venue brings up the idea of the emergence of a public sphere. So the person who really pushed this idea was a guy by the name of, Jürgen Habermas. He's a 20th century German philosopher, at least that's where he really got his start, and he's still with us. So he talks about the importance of what he calls this public sphere in his book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. So he talks about the importance of a public discussion that exists in society in this public sphere, meeting places where people can feel free, they can feel safe, sharing their opinions with others. Citizens get together and they freely discuss and identify problems perhaps within society. And then, according to Habermas, a sound government and a democracy then pays attention to that discussion, and those government representatives act upon what they hear. And in this way, public discussion can then influence political action, at least that's the idea. Habermas argues that the environment of robust, reasoned debate which existed in 18th century Europe, that is back in the 1700s, that was the heyday of the public sphere. Many people then were, I think I've got an image here, look at that image in the left. That's a salon in Paris where, a variety of people would get together, discuss public issues, government leaders would pay attention, and in that way the people were essentially then participating in decision-making. As I said before, their input mattered. So as you might imagine, as we see on this slide, Habermas is worried that we have been headed for a long time toward a very bad situation, That is, he's arguing that the public sphere, the way he thought about it, is declining now in modern society. He argues that open, reasoned debate has been replaced in contemporary society by, you guessed it, shallow, slick promotion, advertising, and publicity. The robust and reasoned debate about public issues has been lost, he worries. But that brings about some big questions. Is a free media, that is, an advertising-driven media, is it a disruptor to the political system? Or does it force more transparency in the political process, as all this advertising reminds us of the positions of the various candidates? Also, have our changing media systems led to more accountability of those in power, or have they only created an environment where the political process is more susceptible now to manipulation? Habermas puts the blame for this loss of the ideal public sphere squarely on the modern media. That said, Habermas does have his critics who question whether informed and reasoned discussion did it ever really exist? Or were decisions, even back then, always made by elites in society who controlled and manipulated messages back then just as they do now? They kind of wonder about that. Also, looking at the more contemporary situation, some critics wonder if perhaps social media are now filling in where the salons left off. Are they our new public sphere situations? Aren't platforms like Twitter and Facebook essentially the same thing as public forums where we can share our ideas about topics, we can debate, we can discuss about the big issues facing society? Or is there something about them that makes that open discussion not really that realistic? We'll be addressing that a little bit later. This ends Media and Politics Part 1.